Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was Disney's first ever feature film way back in 1937, is the next up on the conveyor belt as the studio continues to churn out live action remakes of its entire classic canon. The film also arrives with just a tremendous amount of baggage, swept up in the culture war and scorned as a corporate cash grab at best and an assault on traditional values by Hollywood at worst. So is the modern adaptation as bad as many people expect? Or can it rise above the criticism and become a pleasant surprise? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, as I said, it's hard for me to think of another film in recent years that has just been surrounded by as much drama as this one has. And so it's almost a little bit anticlimactic that the actual film turns out to be mostly fine. Is it a great film? No, it is not. But is it the abomination that it has been sort of heralded as being? I think also no. I didn't love this film, but I also didn't find it offensively bad or anything like that. I think with modest expectations and the ability to block out some of the external noise, Snow White is a perfectly watchable remake that occasionally does capture some of the charms of the original, and I think also offers some new additions that actually add value to the familiar tale, even if at times it does feel a bit more like watching a mediocre Disneyland stage play than it does feel like being swept up into an exciting fairy tale. The original 1937 film is a beloved classic for a reason. I actually rewatched it yesterday to prepare for this one, and I think it's as delightful now as it was nearly 90 years ago. But 90 years is a long time, and not all change is evil. Because setting aside just nostalgia, you really don't need to be some patriarchy smashing fourth wave feminist to admit that there are some aspects of the original that could use a little bit of modern polish. I mean, a nameless prince so infatuated with the physical beauty of a seemingly dead princess that then scours the land for the opportunity to kiss her corpse doesn't exactly pass the 2025 vibe test. And ironically, I think while the notion of modern changes has become a rallying cry against the film, many of the alterations and additions to this story I think actually positively address criticisms that many Christians have leveled against Disney for decades, such as the promotion of superficial beauty or the shallow love at first sight romance. Where I think this movie does sort of go awry, however, is in the actual execution of some of those changes. Because reimagining Snow White as a woman defined more by the fairness of her virtuous character rather than her skin, and capable of actively leading rather than just passively waiting to attract a charming husband with her beauty, I think is a worthwhile change. But I think akin to movies like the Barbie movie or Captain Marvel, Hollywood continues just to struggle at elevating this type of modern female character without a very heavy-handed and I think pretentious tone. Because while the old Snow White was a very maternal and nurturing figure, the modern Snow White spends the bulk of her screen time merely just lecturing the other characters. And I know people have very strong opinions about Rachel Zegler, but she is a talented actress with a very angelic singing voice, but she's just unable to do much with the material that she is given, resulting in, I think, a very wooden performance that just lacks the warmth of her animated counterpart. Similarly, kind of gone is the prince of the original, replaced here by a roguish, Robin Hood inspired outlaw, and he is a far more interesting character. I mean, we even get an actual name for him, Jonathan, but at the same time, the movie also seems to lose its momentum whenever it does focus on sort of this newly conceived subplot of him and rebellion to overthrow the queen and take back the kingdom, rather than when it's translating the original existing scenes onto the screen. Kind of by the same token, kind of musically, classic songs like Hi Ho or Whistle While You Work make fun and triumphant returns, but with the exception of the standout song Waiting on a Wish, which I just think is a really good modern Disney song, the other new songs just don't make any kind of impression, ranging kind of from forgettable to just downright bad. And I don't think it helps matters at all that Gal Gadot, who gives an even stiffer performance than Zegler, is given like multiple villain songs, and like God bless her, but she is just not a gifted singer. As far as the visuals go, I actually think perhaps more than like many of the other modern remakes, kind of Snow White's like vibrant colors and like almost cartoonish appearance manages to capture at least some of like the enchanted like storybook aesthetic of the original film. Like it's all very glossy and really none of it looks real, but I do think it works for sort of the intended like fairy tale atmosphere. Much less convincing to me are the seven dwarves themselves. The character redesigns definitely take a moment to like get used to, and I think they do lack some of the endearing, lovable qualities of the original, but I think in the end they're mostly fine. The actual like animation of the characters, however, just appears like almost half finished, which I think is perhaps due to the fact that I think like mid-production they decided to like swap live actors for CGI versions, but it just feels very like dated in a way that just prevents them from ever feeling like they actually like occupy the world in any kind of real or like tactile way. Although I think like appearances aside, the characters themselves do remain as amusing and like, as fun as ever. I think the film is definitely like, at its best when it does sort of focus on the relationship between them and Snow White. As far as content I consider, things going on the surface of this, thankfully not a whole lot here at all. For language, one dwarf says like shish kebab, sort of like as an assumed replacement for a curse, and another one yells yippee-ki-yay like amid a brawl, which seems to be like a reference to Die Hard, although obviously without like the F-bomb that follows that original quote. As far as violence, really nothing going on here either. A man gets shot with like a crossbow bolt, although there's no blood, and he ultimately is fine and survives. There is like plenty of talk about murders and murdered characters, although none of those are actually like shown on screen. Perhaps the most like frightening or whatever of the violence is that unlike the original, where the evil queen's death is not actually shown like in the shot, her grim fate is depicted here, kind of as her whole body turns to some sort of like dust, kind of a la the ending of the first Harry Potter movie. For sexuality, nothing that I noticed in this film, but the only other kind of content stuff is, I think, consistent with the original. The evil queen character is like a sorceress and is shown doing like dark magic and spells throughout. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, to me, I think part of what makes sort of the cultural war rhetoric around this film so unhelpful is that I think it just sort of directs its passion in the wrong direction. For example, you may have seen sort of the mean-spirited meme that seems to be circulating like, around the internet lately, comparing like the two lead actresses and implying that Gadot, considered to be one of the most beautiful women in Hollywood, is clearly like miscast as a character who can, should be concerned about Zegler usurping her claim as the fairest one of all. But besides just like the nastiness of that meme, I think it also completely misses the point of like this film's main thematic message, which is that like beauty and fairness are not skin deep. And the casting of Rachel Zegler, who is Latina, as Snow White was also widely criticized, given that the original character is named, like at least in part, due to her white skin tone. And the film kind of gets around this by creating a backstory where she was like born in the middle of a snowstorm. And it is like a little bit contrived, but I think kind of like a agreeable byproduct of that decision is that it does sort of like recontextualize like what it means to be fair and beautiful. Because like throughout the film, Snow White wears like a pendant around her neck with the engraved words that say fearless, fair, brave, and true. And sort of those virtues come to represent like the ideal that she strives to like live up to and embody. And kind of like in the end, what ultimately does win her like the admiration of those around her is not just like her physical appearance, but by her like demonstrating kind of kindness and empathy. And so I think even more so than like the original film, this version of the fairy tale like more closely echoes a scripture like 1 Peter 3, which rejects vanity and just paints like a picture of a deeper like biblical definition of like inner beauty. Because in several scenes, like the evil queen compares Snow White to a rose, kind of like a fleeting, fragile beauty, but she just fails to see that like it's really her own vain beauty that will ultimately perish, while like the inner beauty of a virtuous, like Christ-like character endures. So in the end, I think at a time when like Hollywood is perceived by many Christians to be like the enemy, I'm probably expected just to bash this film and like decry the modern changes. But I honestly just didn't hate it or really have any major gripes about some of the changes. I think even so, like whether the fault of Hollywood or merely a byproduct of just the increasingly like jaded and like cynical attitudes of audiences today, the film simply lacks a lot of like the magic of Disney's golden era. No, this is not like an awful film. In fact, it may be among like the upper tier of the Disney live action remakes. Granted, that bar has been set like exceedingly low, but despite sort of online rhetoric swirling around this, the film doesn't like desecrate the legacy of the original or like assault conservative values. I think this movie's faults are just far less interesting than that, because to me, Snow White is a film that just sort of is almost as lifeless as its princess after biting into that poison apple. And unfortunately, in true modern Disney fashion, there's no charming prince around to save the day. But hey, I expect this is going to be a film that many of you have opinions on. So be respectful, but don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. Encourage you guys to, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.